Hey, what's up, guys? We're here with Ruxter and Michael, two people that are pretty good with philosophy, and we're going to be responding to the latest and very talked about video from Rationality Rules concerning veganism and why he currently rejects it. I actually am a pretty big fan of Rationality Rules, so I don't think he's coming across as unreasonable as many of the other people we tend to criticize here. But yeah, there's definitely some things he said that we were a bit confused on and don't agree with. And we're not going to be covering, or at least I'm not going to be covering or posting every single thing that we say while watching this video, because it's 30 minutes long, the original video, and we'd be here for a long time. So let's get right into it.
That said, though, let me make clear from the outset that I'm not claiming to have an ethical argument against veganism. No, I'm merely going to provide two reasons as to why I don't buy the case for ethical veganism, and I'll then controversially argue that most people subconsciously reject ethical veganism for one of the same reasons that I do. Now, my illustrations are going to focus on the dairy and egg industry, that is, vegan objections to vegetarianism, and it's for two reasons. First, it's because I'm a vegetarian, and a large point of my meandering here is to explain why I'm a vegetarian instead of a vegan. And second, because it stands to reason that a successful moral argument against the vegetarian position is going to simultaneously defeat the omnivorous position, since the omnivorous position entails all of the harms caused by the vegetarian position and then some. So what I've done is found an argument for ethical veganism that strikes a healthy balance between 1, being a strong argument, and 2, resembling a typical popular argument, and in the process of attempting to stillman it will account for the dialectic. In my opinion, too often vegan arguments are shut down due to certain details being undefined or misunderstood, and my hope is that this approach will mitigate these issues.
Here we go.
According to the Effective Altruism Foundation, the strongest argument for veganism goes as follows. Premise 1. We shouldn't be cruel to animals. That is, we shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily. Premise 2. The consumption of animal products harms animals. Premise 3. The consumption of animal products is unnecessary. Conclusion. Therefore, we shouldn't consume animal products. Now, this strikes me as a broadly convincing argument, and the authors solidify it with a very compelling question. At which point could one plausibly block this line of reasoning? If you consume animal products, then which of these premises do you reject? Because seemingly, we have to reject one of these premises or go vegan. And I say seemingly, of course, because it's possible that one can completely accept the vegan argument and yet simultaneously be convinced of a mutually exclusive argument that supersedes priority, such as one's optimum health being at odds with veganism.
Why the fuck aren't you vegan yet?
I began to feel that I wasn't getting enough protein.
Still, this doesn't justify eating factory farm steak though, does it, Mr. Wellbeing?
Ooh.
But in and of itself, the argument is pretty simple. If we shouldn't unnecessarily harm animals, and the consumption of animal products unnecessarily harms animals, then trivially we shouldn't consume animals. It's that simple. Alright, well, let's analyse each of these premises and then strengthen them when and where we can. Premise 1. We shouldn't be cruel to animals. That is, we shouldn't consume animal products unnecessarily. The statement that we shouldn't be cruel to animals is very compelling, since rejecting this implies that one is perfectly fine with animal cruelty. But without the word unnecessarily in the forefront, this premise is just false, as it's easy to conjure a situation in which being cruel to animals is justified. For instance, the poisoning of rats to prevent spread of disease. Killing rats with poison is, without doubt, extremely cruel. It's a very, very nasty death, but it can, in certain situations, be justified on account of it being necessary to keep children safe, etc. And especially when other means of preventing proliferation are not as effective. The restated form of this premise, however, doesn't suffer this objection, since it states that we shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily. Given this, let's drop the former part. We shouldn't harm animals unnecessarily. Or as my dear friend Alex O'Connor has more potently put it,
that extraordinary harm and mistreatment requires extraordinary justification.
Lastly, let's switch the word animals with sentient beings, as it's the capacity to experience feelings and sensations that's of specific relevance, not the kingdom a being belongs to. Now for sure, I'm being pedantic here, and despite this change, I will from here on use the words animals and sentient beings as if they're synonymous. But since we're strengthening the argument, let's dot the I's and cross the T's. Premise 2. The consumption of animal products harms animals. On a literal reading, this premise is just false. It's not the consumption of animal products that causes harm, but rather the process of acquiring the animal product that, more often than not, causes harm. When a hunter
I would say I agree with that. I mean, this is why many vegans don't take issue with eating animals in the form of roadkill or eating an animal product that otherwise is going to be thrown out, and you know that your consumption of the product has an increased demand in some form. So, I mean, I would say I agree with that. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
I have an issue with like ethical veganism.
Yeah, so long as you're not like deliberately increasing the exploitation and suffering of animals by doing so. It's like I don't see an issue with it. Because if it's just there and it's no one's being harmed by it, I don't think I see an issue with it. So
cooks and eats a deer, he's not harmed.
What's that?
I said I ain't no deontologist.
Right. Yeah, we should say there are many vegans who hold like a strong deontological view of like you cannot consume animal products in any situation ever, or in a situation where even consuming that animal product doesn't generate demand.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
Yeah, I think people will also say that like, oh, when you consume the roadkill or you consume animals in these particular instances, they'll say that like it's not vegan. But then at that point, it's like, all right, so it's like, do I care? Because like if you're defining it in such a way where it's like me doing this doesn't even contribute to any harm, and you're calling it not vegan, do I really care that it's actually vegan at that point? Because now you've just defined it so vaguely where it now covers things where it doesn't have like a moral issue in it.
Right. And like at the end of the day, like we care about what's the most right thing to do, not what is the most vegan thing to do. There could be a part of the vegan definition which makes certain actions that literally cause zero suffering to be considered non-vegan.
Yeah.
But again,
if that's the case, then like why would I care that particular instance it's not vegan? It's like by this definition, right? Mm-hmm. I just don't think that's a really good definition to use, because you're going to be sort of like labeling something that's like not vegan, and the implication is that like it's wrong to do so, when in actuality there's no negative utility that happens as like a result. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no rights violations unless you hold this weird like deontological view on veganism. But
harming the deer. No, he harmed the deer and the deer's kin, if it had any, when, in an act of pure masculinity, he equipped himself with an incredibly powerful and accurate weapon, found a safe space, and pulled the trigger from hundreds of feet away. Likewise, when someone, such as myself, cooks and eats an egg, I don't harm the chicken. No, I harm the chicken when, in an act of pure masculinity, I paid someone else millions of feet away to harvest the chicken period for me. So it's not the consumption of animal products in and of itself that causes harm.
Hold on, and I said this to Michael. Like it's like the language he uses suggests that like he's a vegan, because like he consumes like egg and dairy, and he just literally called it like a chicken period. Like I don't know, it's a little confusing.
And he was sarcastically referring to it as like an ask of pure masculinity, you know, the way that I and my channel will refer to people who pay others to harm the innocents and the vulnerable, you know. And he's also referring to vegetarian animal products, not meat-based ones.
Exactly. So it's very confusing that like he uses this type of language, but yet he's still not a vegan. I don't know. Like, just throwing that out there, it's kind of confusing.
Yeah, definitely.
The deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings that causes harm. Now, I use the words deliberate acquisition because it carries the connotation of consciously and intentionally obtaining the product, and not necessarily with currency. If, for instance, I did some gardening for someone on the assumption that they'll cook me fish and chips as payment, or at least part of the payment, then make no mistake about it.
I wouldn't
be
even
deliberately acquiring.
I'm like
fish.
thinking about this now. I don't even think that like putting deliberate there is, well, one is needed, but two, I don't think it somehow like alleviates one from like, it might like justify as to why you don't or why you do like contribute to like some type of suffering, because you're just not aware, right? Like it's unintentional. But the fact that like something is unintentional still doesn't take away from the fact that like it could still be wrong, right? Because like I can unintentionally do something that ought not happen. If we take right or wrong, good or bad to be like action guiding like language, meaning something ought happen or ought not happen. Just because I don't do something deliberately doesn't mean that consequence or that action in and of itself ought not happen.
Yeah, meat eaters can make the argument that when they buy meat, they're not intending to kill an animal.
Exactly.
They're intending to buy meat, and then we still acknowledge that it's wrong.
And it doesn't entail that like now it's like permissible, right? It's not more. It's still wrong to do it, right? You're just offering some sort of like explanation as to why the behavior is occurring in the first place. But like,
well, as currently formulated, like if you actually somehow didn't know that meat came from animals and you went to the store and bought like 6 pounds of beef, that's just a neutral action because it wasn't deliberate, just according to how it was formulated, the premise.
Yeah. So like on our view, even though he wasn't aware of it, that action like still like ought not happen, right? It's something we prefer it not to happen.
Right.
So
I
don't
think one could have the knowledge of the problem of their action without intending to like support or bring into existence the problem. Like someone could be aware that the animals are going to die for their steak, but they can go, but I'm just intending to buy the steak. Like, you know, and of course, like it's obviously still wrong.
Yeah. I don't think it's a good, like the premise is formulated very well. Like, I know he's trying to steelman it as best he can, and like he's trying to make intention like something that we should like factor in when it comes to like the acquisition of animal products. But I think we can all agree that like intention or not, we're going to evaluate the same, and it's wrong, right? We may say that like if the person has the intent to like harm the animal, we may evaluate the action maybe a little bit more wrong because we'll take that intention into consideration. But at the end of the day, intention or not, like the action is still bad. Right. So I don't think that alleviates like I don't think that makes the action permissible at the end of the day. That's what I'm trying.
Right. Yeah, agreed.
But suppose instead that I found a dead fish washed up on the beach and decided to take it home and eat it. In this case, is it fair to say that I harmed the fish or deliberately obtained the fish? Well, as far as I'm convinced, the answer is no. And so I just don't see an explicit issue with such an act. To be clear, I've never done this, but given my understanding of ethical veganism, this seems perfectly consistent with it. Just so long, of course, I'm not deliberately walking along the beach to find dead fish. Now, some will argue that taking the fish harms other animals.
Yeah, I don't think the issue here is the deliberateness. It's just the fact that it's not adding to any type of demand or any type of negative utility. Like I don't see where the deliberate plays into that example.
Yeah, because like if I deliberately just walked along the coastlines of the beach just looking for dead fish, and that's like it's deliberate, right? Like I'm actually intending to do that. Like how am I increasing like suffering? Right? How am I actually like increasing the amount of like animal exploitation and cruelty in the world? Like how, like I don't know why he said that. That's a little confusing.
Some people might say that you're taking away food from another animal who would have otherwise consumed it. That's like I think he also addresses that coming up.
Oh, okay.
So we could hear that part. But then he sort of invalidates that objection with the fact that crop deaths exist, which is I felt kind of weird.
One thing is even if that's true, even if we grant that it's wrong because it's going to cause disutility by taking away food from other animals, which is then going to like kill another fish that wouldn't have been killed otherwise. It's wrong because it's like increasing the amount of fish that die. It's not wrong because it was deliberate. Like the deliberate is still not the thing that's making it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. It would be wrong for the reasons related to increase in disutility, not I just deliberately. It's like a weird like deontological objection to deliberation or something, like being deliberate in your
because like
action.
for like deontology, they kind of like some branches or like some subsets of deontology focus on like intentions only, and it sounds like that's what's being appealed to here. It's like they're just worrying about like what that person's intending to do versus like what the action is and the outcome of the action. Right.
Yeah. Right.
It's like they're missing a huge component like when they're gauging like actions, because I think outcome is extremely important when trying to gauge if an action's right or wrong. But
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, buddy.
All right.
That would have otherwise consumed the fish. And while this objection is worth considering, I think it's ultimately nullified by the fact that vegans also harm surrounding animals when they forcibly occupy land to produce and consume crops. Thus, since both cases suffer the same objection, within the context of comparing the two cases, this objection can be ignored.
No, there could be a symmetry breaker between the two instances. Why would he say that? How was that nullified? Because like there could be like a morally relevant distinction between one versus the other. Like just because like one harms, like what there's disutility in one instance and there's disutility in another, the nature of the disutility drain could make one like morally permissible, one not. Right?
Yeah.
Or am I tripping?
No, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
We'd have to just now go into depth as to like, you know, what happens when land is cleared for crop field production and see if like there is a symmetry breaker between doing that and then grabbing a fish off out of the coast of the ocean that could have otherwise been consumed by another animal. Yeah, it seemed a little weird to object to it based on like almost like hypocrisy. It seemed like, I don't know if he was going for that. I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah, it's like we can object to that because vegans also contribute to suffering. Yeah, it's almost too Coqui-ish direction.
Yeah.
Like, so it kind of sounds like, but I could be wrong though.
Yeah, and although he said the animals that die in creating land, you know, if he were to say something like animals that die out of defensive crops or something like that, like we could easily say like, well, there is a symmetry breaker there. There's also, when it comes to the crop fields in general, like we don't even know if they cause a net increase in suffering, you know, compared to wild field, which I think is important to point out. And we also, I mean, we don't really know that with the grabbing of the fish either. That's something that's like an empirical claim.
Yeah.
You know, So both would need to be, I guess, substantiated to even like try to compare them in one justifying the other or nullifying the other. You know, so I think all that needs to be taken care of before we like just take those two instances of animals being harmed and like using one to nullify the other.
Yeah. Because it almost seems like he's saying that like,
Well, so it's unclear that either of them are justified.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
What was
it's
that?
just unclear because it sounds like they're just empirical. That's just an empirical matter. Like he actually has, the person who's making that claim has to demonstrate there's actually like net disutility that's occurring as a result of like.
Or they'd have to like modify the examples to like take into account the amount of harm or benefit so that you could actually provide them, like just pointing to two vague examples that we don't know any of the details of and saying like, oh, one shows that the other can't be justified. Like it's just too vague for that. You would need to account for it in the hypothetical.
Right.
The same objection, within the context of comparing the two cases, this objection can be ignored. To get back on the rails, the question is, does the deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings harm sentient beings? At a glance, the answer is obviously yes. When I buy a pint of milk, I pay for an industry to harm sentient beings. However, there are some interesting objections that are worthwhile mentioning. For instance, in order to acquire the milk, it's necessary to ensure that the cow receives adequate shelter and sustenance, which in the state of nature, they often don't. From this, it can be argued, then, that on average, farming increases the well-being of animals. What's more, if it wasn't for humans consuming animal produce, then billions of animals wouldn't have existed and thus experienced any happiness in the first place. Now, while a fair few find these objections compelling, I'm not among them. We'd never apply these objections to humans. That is, we'd never say that since we provide shelter and sustenance
Why bring
to
it
other
up?
humans, we can confine them and end their life prematurely. Or that
There's
if we
some insane utilitarians that would apply those to you.
I know. Yeah, I know. That's that's true.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
it's like-
I appreciate him bringing it up in that he's letting us know, I guess, that those reasons don't appeal to him or he doesn't find them to be good reasons to accept continuing to farm dairy. But yeah, I don't know. I think maybe rationality rules, like Steven likes to cover all ground almost. You know, he's very, if you watch his other content, he's very like something he's prone to doing, like where he will bring up outside perspectives just to like, you know, make his video more like it just covers more ground, I guess, answers more questions. Because some
Yeah.
people might even like ask that in the comments, like, oh well, Steve, what do you think about this though? Doesn't this cause an increase in utility on the net? So maybe he just wanted to cover that in advance.
I got you. Yeah. I think we can clearly say if we put those examples in the human context, you know, does it justify the animal agriculture industry or replace the animals with humans, the human agriculture industry, just because we give them a good life and we breed them to existence and they're able to experience well-being and happiness. You know, that isn't morally permissible though.
Yeah, he's doing that right now, actually.
Oh,
He's-
okay, gotcha.
Yeah, he's explaining why we wouldn't accept it in the human case.
didn't eat other humans, they would never experience any happiness in the first place. And once human comparison comes up, the dialectic spirals in 1,000 different directions, and so we'll put a pin in it here. That said, if there's enough objection to this premise, I'll revisit it. But honestly, I think it's philosophical masturbation to argue that the deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings doesn't harm sentient beings. Premise 3,
Well,
the consumption of animal
it's
products.
weird because I actually reject P2. I think
I think, well, as it's formulated now, I might accept it if it was modified a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, take the first word out of it, might be okay.
Yeah, because there's I think there's ways that you can like acquire animal products that doesn't harm animals.
Yeah,
So like to say that like the deliberate acquisition of like animal products harms animals, I think that's actually just like a false statement because
it's not necessarily true. Or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
categorically true.
yeah, there's instances where like it clearly harms the animal, but there's also going to be instances where it does. So
Yeah.
like
And furthermore, restricting it to deliberate might not encompass everything that the ethical vegan would want to say is morally impermissible.
right.
Right. Take the easy example, because there might be some vegans freaking out watching this right now. Just take the easy example of finding a feather on the sidewalk. Like the acquisition of that animal product is not going to really cause any harm.
Acquisition of products from sentient beings doesn't harm sentient beings. Premise 3, the consumption of animal products is unnecessary. Assuming that by necessary we mean that something is required for us to continue living, this premise is tethered to one's socio-economic and geographic environment. Within the last 5 years, the vegan options offered in the south of England have massively expanded, with pretty much every restaurant offering fantastic vegan alternatives at affordable prices. This has made my transition towards veganism significantly easier, and it's immensely helped normalize veganism. But what about countries that are not socioeconomically privileged? If one's location prevents them from acquiring necessary nutrition from vegan sources, then they are permitted, it seems, to consume animal produce. And in the same vein, this objection also applies to dietary needs. If one has nutritional needs that can only be obtained from animal produce, then they're justified in consuming the produce that provides it with the least amount of suffering caused, which again typically isn't factory farm cows, is it, Harris?
Why make it easy on myself?
And another consideration here is mental health. Just as some atheists act as if they're theists due to the threat of their family and community ostracizing them, someone who's convinced of veganism might nevertheless consume animal produce simply to maintain relations, because they're emotionally and perhaps physically tethered to others. When I went pescatarian, all of my friends and family ate me, and plenty of them judged.
I just wonder if we like applied this to the humans case, if we would take like that family and friends might ostracize you as like a serious reason to not support factory farming billions of humans. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I was gonna say like this whole mental health part is a little weird. Although I understand the social difficulty that comes with being a vegan and how it can come with all of these like little familial struggles and like like you being ostracized from particular friend groups or family groups. I understand that, but none of that to me should justify financially supporting an animal holocaust. Like we can fully acknowledge, it's hard. I get it. But like that to me does not outweigh in any way like what the animals are going through. You're not like in a factory farm. Your parents aren't putting you in a factory farm when you choose to no longer be an omnivore or whatever. So I don't think that I wouldn't even look at this as a justifying reason to continue to consume.
Well, products. Also this is a competing definition for necessary, right? Yeah. Which is also kind of weird, right? It's like the reason why like it's necessary for me to be like a meat eater or to consume animal products, it's because people will make fun of me, or like my social interactions with people will be like hindered because of it, right? But I think we can safely assume that like that's not like what most people mean when they say necessary, right? Yeah. And if you want to function off that definition or operate under it, like what if you're from like a cannibalistic family and you knew that if you stopped being a cannibal, your family would like shame you and like, for my mental health, I need to continue being a cannibal. Like we wouldn't be like, yeah, bro, go ahead. Yeah, no, we wouldn't say that like it's necessary for him to be a cannibal, right? That's like so weird, right?
And you're not gonna. When he compares it to like how some atheists might find that it's like necessary to not tell their parents they're atheists because they might be ostracized, that's just going to be clearly disanalogous because being atheist isn't immoral, but the action we're looking at here is immoral. Right. There's a very clear circuit breaker.
Me for my decision. What's more, some of them consistently threw objections at me, and because I bit back, a few of my relations significantly suffered. Now, fortunately, I'm not tethered to such people, but that's not true of everyone. And if we consider mental health as necessary, then this premise is not only subject to one's socioeconomic circumstances, but also their mental health. For many, however, including myself, it's fair to say that the consumption of animal products is unnecessary. And finally, and for the same reasons as just covered in relation to premise 2, let's replace consumption with the words deliberate acquisition and animal products with products from sentient beings. With that, I'll now explain why I don't find this compelling argument convincing.
This is an arbitrary definition. You guys are blocking it.
To present the polished argument, here it is. Premise 1, we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily. Premise 2, the deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings harms sentient beings. Premise 3, the deliberate acquisition of products from sentient beings is unnecessary. Conclusion, therefore, we shouldn't deliberately acquire products from sentient beings. Which premise, then, do I reject? Well, I'm sure my response will raise an eyebrow or two, but please hear me out. You might not agree with my position, but I think you'll appreciate it. You'll at least find it consistent. And if you think I'm mistaken, let me know. If I'm mistaken in my assessment, I want to know. The very reason I'm vegetarian as opposed to, say, pescatarian is because I'm sensitive to the arguments. And remember, I'm not arguing here that veganism is unjustified. I'm merely explaining why myself, and I'll go on to argue why I think most people are not vegan. All right.
We should pause on that. Like, so he's not explaining why he thinks that veganism is an unjustified position. He's just explaining why descriptively he's not a vegan, or what is responsible for him not acting in accordance with the vegan moral philosophy. Is that right?
If that's his goal, I'm not sure why you would want to go through the argument and reject premises. It seems that the goal of rejecting premises would be to point out that ethical veganism isn't justified.
Yes, that's what confuses me a lot about this. Like we're going through premises and an argument for veganism, but he's saying that he's not trying to show that veganism is unjustified. What I would expect from somebody who says like, "Hey, I'm not going to give an argument to show that veganism is unjustified, but instead I'm going to show why I'm just not vegan." I would expect them to say something like, "Yeah, I fully acknowledge that veganism is correct, but I just am so compelled by the taste of steak that I am still buying steak, but I acknowledge that that's not correct or moral at all." It's like, but instead we're like going through premises, which is just like, I don't know, to me, it's odd, right?
I think for me, I would expect like you're saying, some sort of explanation as to why he's not a vegan, like a reason, just like, oh, like not because of like I found this argument and I think this argument's not good, right? And then while simultaneously saying, hey, I'm not trying to like refute veganism, or like I'm not trying to like show that it's unjustified. It's like, then why are we going through this? Why are we going through this? What is this endeavor supposed to like establish exactly? Because it seems like he's trying to establish that it's like unjustified, or like it doesn't like give him reason to be vegan or something.
He uses the phrase, "This is why I don't buy veganism." And to me, like when people use that phrase in like a moral sense, they mean like, I don't accept the arguments for veganism to be like sound, or I don't accept the arguments to justify being vegan. I don't know.
It seems like if the reason that you don't buy veganism is because you think the argument for it is unjustified or fails, then I don't know why you would say that you don't think, or you're not setting out to show that the argument is unjustified.
Yeah, like again, we're literally going through premises right now, so I don't know. It's a little odd, but okay.
Well, I reject premise 1, and for 2 reasons. Let's spell out the first. As vegans are well aware, vegan diets raise many moral questions of their own, and one such question is this: what does it mean to say that the deliberate acquisition of a product is necessary? Necessary for what? To again quote Dogat, if it is wrong to hurt chickens for meat, is it wrong to hurt mice and moles while harvesting crops? If it is wrong to harm workers in the production of meat, isn't it wrong to harm workers in the production of tomatoes? If it is wrong to use huge quantities of water for meat, isn't it wrong to use huge quantities of water for almonds? So again, the question is, what does it mean to say that a product is necessary? Is it to live? And if so, to what degree? Is it to live a fully healthy life, or just to live at the cost of, perhaps, a reduction of optimum performance and lifespan? Or at least a reduction in some of the foods we enjoy that are technically vegan, such as almonds? Like, seriously, where's the line here? And more importantly, how does one justify this line? Well, most vegans claim that they deliberately acquire products that harm sentient beings because it's necessary for them, as an individual, to live. Now, the following question might seem a little strange, but it's absolutely a fair philosophical query. How does the vegan determine that their life is worth more than the mice and moles sacrificed in their crops? If the avoidance of harm is so paramount, why does one human life supersede 1,000 mice or 1,000,000 insects? Most people take for granted that living is necessary, and so
this is something we also talked about before. It's like, it could be the case that the vegan knows that like what's happening is like wrong in terms of like the crop productions, but like the reason why they're vegan, it's because it's better than alternative, right? It's like, it could be the case, like clearly there's going to be, I hold the view that there's going to be way more harm that's contributed on like an omnivorous diet than a vegan diet. And it could be like the reason why they're vegan is because they want to reduce that type of harm, right? And they're not making some claim that like my life is more important than 1,000 moles or 1,000,000 insects. They're just saying, hey, like I understand like harm, it happens as a byproduct of my mere existence, and I want to mitigate that. I think he might be like jumping the gun when he says that vegan is like making this sort of like elitist claim that they're more important than all these animals, like combined or something. What do you think?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think that the vegan, like Ruxter was saying, I think that a vegan could potentially, they wouldn't have to, but they could bite the bullet on that and say it is wrong for us to kill thousands and thousands of moles and voles when we do the fields, and my life is actually worth less than them. But it wouldn't follow from there that like I should starve myself, or I should let these moles and voles live instead of me, because it could be that the alternative is worse, that if I let myself die, I'm actually the one that would have been advocating to find a solution to crop deaths, where like the other people that weren't vegans wouldn't in the future be searching for a solution to crop deaths. So it's actually going to like decrease the amount of utility in the future.
Yeah, it's like that one video I made where I talked about how not living at all, it isn't clear that not living at all would actually provide a net positive amount of like well-being or reduction in suffering, given how much suffering we may actually be preventing as a result of our existence. But it doesn't seem like we have to make any claim like that. And then also just when it comes to crop fields, like I've talked about this a million times on my channel, and you know too, Ruxter, like I'm not even sure that they're problematic when it comes to death and even especially suffering of animals when you compare the state of wild animal suffering and what happens in the wild. So that also needs to be demonstrated as well for me to even deem crop fields as something problematic.
Yep.
Tend to focus on this implicit premise, this definition of unnecessary. But as far as I can tell, this definition is completely arbitrary. It simply assumes that, in principle, it's perfectly fine to maintain one human.
I've heard.
Go ahead.
This is one of the worst things I've ever heard. Yeah, like, not again, I have respect for the guy, but like rejecting to a premise because it has a word that's arbitrary. One, I don't see how that affects the truth value of the proposition. Right. And two, I hold this view. Maybe you hold a different view, Michael. I'm saying that rhetorically. I was under the impression that all words were defined arbitrarily.
Yeah. No, I hold a similar view.
I
also think that when we define a word and then we say, like, this is what we mean by the word, the proposition the word means this is just going to be analytic so long as that's what we mean by the word.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it means to say it's unjustified.
Yeah, because it's going to be true in virtue of how the word's being used or how it's being defined. To say it's unjustified, it's like, it's almost like you're like talking past the person or something. It's like, oh, that definition's arbitrary. It's like, well, this is how the word's being used.
In the argument, this is just what we mean when we say unnecessary.
So yeah, and also, what is this word being defined this way? Let's say I accept the whole notion that it's unjustified. Okay, how do you get from a word being arbitrarily defined to I reject this premise of the argument? Meaning, like you're contesting that the proposition's false, the premise is false.
Right. I think it better be.
You make that leap. Like,
it'd be better to just ask for a definition that is being used for the word, and then go forward with hearing out the argument. Not like rejecting it because the word seems arbitrarily defined to you. We can actually define it for you, like concretely. Yeah. Real quick, and then let me now hear what you think.
But also, my issue might be like if he asks you like, oh, why did you define it that way? And if you responded like, that's just what I take the word to mean. Yeah. Right. If he responds like, well, that's unjustified or that's arbitrary, it's such a vacuous criticism because that's just going to be true of all words. Yeah. Right. We just randomly just decided to like, hey, this word is just going to mean like this string of like ideas or whatever. Right. There wasn't like this like mind independent thing out there that gave us like these notions of these words. Like, hey, this word should be defined this way. It's like, no, it's just going to be like dependent upon maybe like the society that you're in or the specific individuals, because I know we all use words to mean different things. Right. Right. So like, I won't criticize your view because like, let's say you define well-being a certain way. Right. And then I say, okay, why did you define it this way? And you're like, dude, that's just how I define it. If I say that's unjustified and arbitrary, I'm just going to look like an asshole. Like, yeah.
So like, if we make the criticism that like the definition of unnecessary is going to have an implicit definition, like so is the word harm, so is the word beings, so is like so many of the words in these arguments.
Yeah. And if he wants to, and sorry, I know I keep going, but
no, it's okay.
If he wants to remain consistent, he literally has to reject every single argument in existence. Yeah. That's the reductio, because all those words are going to be defined arbitrarily, like at some point. So
yeah. And aside from this, I will say, like, we all agree that vegans using the words like unnecessary or like you should go vegan to prevent unnecessary harm or like you're causing needless suffering, like saying these things as a vegan does put you in a weird trap, because we all know that consuming an excess of calories results in more crop deaths, which would mean that you are causing, quote, needless suffering or causing unnecessary suffering. So we all agree that the use of the term is there's comes with problems, and it'd be better to just go about it a different route. But this reason to reject the specific premise is just weird and doesn't, to me and to you guys, qualify as a reason to view a premise as like unjustified or something. Just ask for the definition for the word and then hear it out and see how you feel afterwards, you know?
Yeah. I don't think this does anything to sort of like change the truth value of a proposition. I don't think this makes a proposition false. And that's why I'm really confused by this thing.
Yeah.
human life at the expense of infinite harm caused to infinite beings, just so long as there's no alternative method of maintaining the human's life without such harm. To illustrate this principle, suppose an ethical vegan was lost at sea with shipmates. If harming sentient beings can be justified in the name of continuing one's existence, then the vegan would eventually be justified in killing a shipmate for sustenance. Hell, with time they'd be justified in killing everyone on the ship. Now, one might be tempted to retort that humans are in a special category, and so it's never justifiable to harm one another for sustenance. But to take this route is to engage in human supremacy, and if we're going to opt for such a move, why not do it from the outset and say that something is unnecessary if it isn't required to advance human well-being? But to get back to the central point, the main takeaway is that the implicit premise, the premise that something is unnecessary if it isn't required for humans to continue living, just isn't justified at all. It's a presupposition. And because it's not justified, we don't have a justified means of convincing others to adopt this specific arbitrary premise over other and equally arbitrary premises, such as something being unnecessary if it isn't required to advance human well-being.
Every argument is unjustified and arbitrary.
Go for it.
No, we're just reiterating every premise, every word of every premise of an argument would just fall prey to this criticism. I don't see what this does. So I just.
Now, utilitarians infer from our sovereign masters that the right thing to do is to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. And of course, if one adopts these premises, then it simply follows that unnecessary harm to sentient beings is immoral. Utilitarians then affirm the first premise of the ethical vegan argument. To unnecessarily harm sentient beings is to minimize happiness and maximize suffering. However, I think that utilitarians are subtly but significantly mistaken in their assessment. Bentham died in 1832, 27 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species, but we today are so fortunate as to stand on the shoulders of both of these giants. As far as our current understanding goes, primates evolved around 55 million years ago, and most species of primate today, perhaps all, have very complex sociality. The benefits of social species include excellent anti-predation response, increased resource detection, cooperative learning, and so on. And crucially, these traits are more akin to software as opposed to hardware. Take, for instance, the intuition not to unnecessarily harm one's kin. This intuition is so overwhelmingly etched in us that it strikes us as almost transcendent, and for many, as literally transcendent, almost as if, to borrow biblical language, it's written on our heart. And the fact that almost all of us intuit this principle speaks of how heavily nature has, over eons, aggressively selected for it. Or to put this another way, our ancestors that inherited the don't unnecessarily harm your kin .intuition patch had a survival advantage over those who didn't. The same is true of those who inherited the don't unnecessarily steal from your kin .intuition patch. Now, while most social species simply run the script and get on with their life, never questioning why they have the intuition, in recent millennia humans have been asking why. Why do we have this intuition? What is morality? What is this standard? What makes something right or wrong? And ethical veganism is, by my lights at least, the result of answering this question in the tone resembling Bentham. The subtle but significant issue though, and here's where my second objection begins, is that I think that ethical vegans, and indeed utilitarians, have misdiagnosed our moral software. We're not running the patch we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily. No, definitely not. We're predators for crying out loud. We're running the patch we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily, and thus, per my first response, I not only believe that the first premise rests on an arbitrary implicit premise, but worse, per this second response, I think that the arbitrary implicit premise that most people affirm isn't actually the premise they say they affirm. Well, most people...
Okay.
So
There's a few.
Yeah. This part's hard to...
Yeah, so the last objection I thought was not so great. I think this one's actually worse.
Yeah. Well,
the
first thing about this is like whether or not our moral intuitions are more in line with not wanting to harm our kin or not harming sentient beings. This just seems like an entirely empirical question. And the second thing is it just doesn't have anything to do with the argument as stated.
Yeah. And it seems
he said that it had to do with this is like one of the things like that are responsible for his second objection, which is that we may not be functioning or consciously aware of what we're really trying to do, or like the evolutionary reasons as to why we feel a certain way about or whatever's driving like this what's it called, this intuition that we should not harm sentient beings. He thinks we might be wrong in thinking that it's sentient beings is more instead our kin, given that evolution selected for this. But I don't know why this would
I'm not sure why it's important either.
I don't know why. So my thing is like, I don't know why. It's almost like he's saying that like P1 is like I reject P1 because people are actually affirming this separate premise. You know, when they're reading this argument, it's almost like I don't care if people misunderstand the premise of the argument. right? That doesn't tell me if you're supposed to take it at its like what they're actually trying to convey, right? It doesn't say anything about like that interpretation being like that interpretation of the proposition being true or false, right? All you're just telling me is that there's some people out there that might affirm this proposition, but they're actually affirming a different proposition because they're misunderstanding it. What does that have? What does that tell you about the argument? Like, it's like you're just acknowledging a separate thing altogether.
Yeah.
So like imagine objecting to a premise of an argument because people can misunderstand it.
Yeah.
What
Right.
does that mean?
Yeah.
What is that? What is that?
It's also it's unclear that it's even going to be true. Like, I feel like most people are going to intuitively agree that like torturing dogs is wrong. That's harming a sentient being unnecessarily. It's not harming our kin unnecessarily. Like, or even if you want to say dogs are our kin, I think you like pick some animal that's not our kin. Most people are going to have like an intuitive problem with just like kicking it around for no reason.
Yeah, but they would be mistaken for the evolutionary reason for why they have those intuitions.
Oh, jeez.
It is a really weird thing to point out as like a reason for objecting to veganism. It's like
There's
I
a reason
don't know.
to object to the premise, man.
I mean, yeah, straightforwardly,
just
it
the
just doesn't
premise.
address the argument. It doesn't address any premises. Doesn't affect the validity or soundness of the argument.
Yeah, we can even grant that this is what people are actually operating under or something, or the premise they're meaning to assert. You know, when they say it. But how does that act as like a reason for you to reject? Because there's two reasons, right? He's rejecting veganism so far, or doesn't buy veganism, whatever that means. Even though he's not actually giving an argument against it. I don't. We're still confused on that as well. Like what we're even doing here. But yeah,
I think this is also an empirical question too. It's
yeah. I'm not convinced of it.
I'm not convinced of that either. That most people are like actually thinking of this than that. Like I don't buy that.
Like you would have to like almost poll a whole bunch of people and see like, do you intuitively take issue with harming sentient beings or just harming our kins unnecessarily?
But how could we do those polls if like the other claim is that people are mistaken? Like their answers might not even be worth taking into consideration because they might be mistaken.
If that's the claim, if the claim is that people are mistaken about their own moral intuitions, I don't even know how you would go about establishing.
I don't know either. These things are kind of hard to verify, I guess. But anyway.
People say that they affirm the premise that we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily. I think that what they're actually affirming is we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily. Yeah, I know this is...
Oh, he showed a dog there. Kind of related to what you said.
Cute little dog.
Because you were saying, oh, maybe he considers dog as a kin as well. So he showed a dog there.
We would also have to iron out what kin even means.
Yeah.
But stick with me, if only for the intrigue. So, if we're running the software, we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily, then why does this seem synonymous with we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily? And if they're so similar, why make the distinction? Well, this brings us to the eminent vegan philosopher Peter Singer, who has captured our kin in his term, the circle of altruism. Who precisely is in our circle of altruism? Who do we consider our kin? Is it just our family, our tribe, our nation, our continent, humanity itself? What about mammals, or indeed all sentient beings? Well, Singer has made the following claim. The circle of altruism has broadened from the family and tribe to the nation and race, and we are beginning to recognize that our obligations extend to all human beings. The process should not stop there. In my earlier book, Animal Liberation, I showed that it is as arbitrary to restrict the principle of equal consideration of interests to our own species as it would be to restrict it to our own race. The only justifiable stopping place for the expansion of altruism is the point at which all whose welfare can be affected by our actions are included within the circle of altruism. This means that all beings with the capacity to feel pleasure or pain should be included. We can improve their welfare by increasing their pleasures and diminishing their pains. The expansion of the moral circle should therefore be pushed out until it includes most animals. Singer is singing in the tone of utilitarianism here, and so let's suppose that sentience is indeed the anchor of morality. That is, that we all have obligations to all sentient beings. Well, the first question that comes to mind is,
Why the fuck aren't you vegan yet?
precisely, why aren't you vegan yet? why am I not vegan yet? And why haven't most people throughout history been vegan? How can it be that most decent people throughout history have so egregiously denied their obligations? In fact, it's worse than this. How have most human beings so utterly failed to even recognize their obligations? And how are people today, alive right now, still failing to recognize their obligations? I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, if this assessment is correct, then we are truly moral monsters. But if, as I argue, we're actually running the software we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily, and who we consider to be our kin is subject to external factors, including resource abundance and education, then we don't have to buy the extremely costly proposition that most people alive today and throughout history are moral monsters. No, to the contrary, we can make perfect sense of historical institutions such as tribal warfare, imperialism, and slavery. Simply put, their circle of altruism wasn't as expansive as ours, and just as most people alive today are genuinely not bothered to hear of a pig's torturous experience because they don't consider the pig within their kin, I strongly doubt that our predecessors were all that bothered to hear of a slave's torturous experience because they didn't consider the slave within their kin. But today we're so fortunate to stand on our ancestors' shoulders as, well, we piss in their face, harshly condemning them for not having the broader circle that we inherited at their expense. But don't worry, it's likely that our children's children will piss on our face too, not understanding why our circle isn't as wide as what theirs will be. Now, needless to say, if you're a fan of objective moral values and duties, then you probably disagree with me. Fine, I get that.
I pure, straight hate you.
But whether you agree with me or not, surely you can see the explanatory scope of my view. It makes a lot of sense of historical moral development and also contemporary moral disagreement. It's a consistent story.
God damn it, do I respect you.
Anyhow, to reiterate my view in relation to the argument, I'm rejecting the first premise altogether. While the proposition that we shouldn't unnecessarily harm sentient beings strikes me as intuitively correct, upon assessment it seems to me that the actual proposition that we accept, that is, the software we're actually running, is we shouldn't unnecessarily harm our kin. As the age of information prospers, living standards increase and readily available...
Wait, does he accept the kin version of that?
Can you go back to where just like a few seconds so that we can see where he had that premise there? So he's rejecting premise 1 because most people are mistaken in affirming this premise. All right, makes sense. Makes lots of sense. So I asked,
wasn't his problem with the word unnecessarily though? Like,
well, that was his first issue. His second issue was the mistaken premise. So I asked like what kin was, and it seemed like he tried to define it there. He said like kin are those within our circle of altruism, but I didn't actually catch what our circle of altruism was. I caught that it should be expanded to include all that can feel pain and pleasure. I caught the fact that it's expanded throughout history, but I don't think that I caught what it actually is. Did either of you guys know? Do you guys know what it is?
He gave examples of like us expanding the because you were saying the circle of altruism, like expanding it to cover like more sentient beings, but he didn't really specify as like what it actually is or what it means.
Because it seems like the premise that he wants to accept is that we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily. And by kin, he just means those currently in the circle of altruism, not those that should be included eventually in the circle of altruism.
That might be problematic.
But it's never been defined like what the circle of altruism is.
Yeah. The reason I brought up the unnecessarily thing is because I'm not sure if he's taking I don't know if he's accepting premise 1A now over here, like the corrected one, fully. And I'd be confused if he was, because he still has a problem with the word unnecessarily.
That's also true too.
So I don't know like if he's gonna be like, now it makes sense to me, because if it doesn't, what about your second objection or your first objection with the word? He might go into that now, I guess.
Yeah, because like if he talked about unnecessarily in the initial premise there, and he had contentions with it. If he's going to like affirm like this hidden premise, right, that also has the word unnecessarily, and presumably there's not going to be an equivocation going on, right? And there's no equivocation going on, then he should similarly reject this hidden premise for the same reasons he rejects P1. You see what I mean?
I see what.
Yeah.
Didn't unnecessarily harm our kin. As the age of information prospers, living standards increase, and readily available vegan alternatives become the norm, our circle of altruism will eventually expand to encompass all sentient beings, and those who don't share the relevant intuitions will nevertheless live by the vegan ethos, since their well-being is tied to tribe acceptance. So veganism will, at least as far as I'm convinced, eventually win, but it won't be because it's wrong to unnecessarily harm sentient beings. It won't be because the ethical vegan argument is sound. No, it will be because our tentative circle of altruism will, for that time and hopefully forever afterwards, encompass all sentient beings. The real first premise, then, is don't unnecessarily harm our kin, and veganism simply isn't entailed by this.
There's something there where if he's saying that it's not going to be because it's wrong to kill all sentient beings, but it will be because it's wrong to harm those that are our kin or in the circle of altruism. But he's saying the circle of altruism will encompass all sentient beings. Then the sentient beings are just a proper subset of the circle of altruism. So it actually will be wrong to harm sentient beings. So I don't know why he said it wouldn't be wrong to harm sentient beings.
Well, because it could be that like the moral status in question is just going to be indexed to whoever's in the circle of altruism. So
right,
like under this view, like it seems like he would say because slaves are not in our circle of altruism, then it's permissible to treat them as such.
Yeah, but if he's saying all sentient beings will be encompassed in the circle of altruism, then for each sentient being, it'll be wrong to kill that being.
Yeah.
So it'll just be wrong to kill sentient beings. That will be true.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that he's also saying that because they're not included, it's okay to like harm them. I think he's trying to say this is the reason why the argument isn't convincing the people, because the first premise doesn't include our kin or our definition of kin has not expanded to the point of including farm animals.
Yeah.
And so that might be what he's trying to say.
I was assuming since he was switching the first premise with that 1A, that the conclusion would also go like it's wrong to, what was the conclusion? Something is wrong to, what was that conclusion there?
Let me see, I can go back. We just watch this again real quick.
To me, that the actual proposition that we accept, that is, the software we're actually running, is we shouldn't unnecessarily harm our kin. As the age of information prospers, living standards increase, and readily available vegan alternatives become the norm, our circle of altruism will eventually expand to encompass all sentient beings, and those who don't share the relevant intuitions will nevertheless live by the vegan ethos, since their well-being is tied to tribe acceptance. So veganism will, at least as far as I'm convinced, eventually win, but it won't be because it's wrong to unnecessarily harm sentient beings. It won't be because the ethical vegan argument is sound. No, it will be because our tentative circle of altruism will, for that time and hopefully forever afterwards, encompass all sentient beings.
That's what I said.
That's a contradiction. Yeah, I see what you're saying, because like presumably if you accept the premise that like it's wrong to harm them your kin unnecessarily, and kin is defined as those who are within your circle of altruism, if they're encompassed by the circle of altruism, right?
Then it will be wrong.
Then it will be wrong. Yeah. And you can't say then it's not going to, That's what
I was trying to say. If sentient beings are going to be a proper subset of those within the circle of altruism, then it is going to be wrong to kill sentient beings.
Yeah.
That proposition will be true.
Well, that'd be true.
It's going to be that it's not because of that it's going to be false. That's a contradiction.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't even catch that. Good catch.
Can you?
Good catch.
I'm not sure. Try to reiterate for me, because I'm not following fully. I don't think.
Yeah, you're the one who caught it. Go ahead. Try to.
So yeah. Do you want to rewind like 5 seconds just to
Sure.
That,
Sure.
Proposition that we shouldn't unnecessarily harm sentient beings strikes me as intuitively correct. Upon assessment, it seems to me that the actual proposition that we accept, that is, the software we're actually running, is we shouldn't unnecessarily harm our kin.
Right, pause right there. He even says the actual proposition that we accept. Yeah. So he's not even.
I had something to write it down so that I could.
Yeah. If you want, here, give me a second.
Get a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Okay.
Give us a second, homeboy.
Yeah, I'll fast forward this part. Don't worry.
So, do you see where it says?
So he is affirming this.
Yeah, he is
affirming. By kin, we just mean within the circle of altruism.
Right. So he's saying that he affirms this premise. He says the premise that we actually affirm is this one: we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily. You're with us so far, right?
Yes.
And then he defines kin as anyone within our circle of altruism, right?
Yeah.
And so then at some point, he says at some point, animals will fall within our circle of altruism, and it wouldn't be wrong to harm them, it would be wrong to harm them, not because they're inside our circle of altruism.
That's what he says. He says that veganism will win out, but it's not going to be because it's wrong to harm sentient beings. So I'm taking it that he's saying it's false that it's wrong to harm sentient beings. That's not the reason, right? But it is because the animals will become part of our circle of or he said it is because our circle of altruism will grow to encompass all animals or all sentient beings. So then if sentient beings is a proper subset, or in other words, if all sentient beings are encompassed within this circle of altruism, and it's wrong to kill anything within the circle of altruism, it just follows from that it's wrong to kill any sentient beings. So he's saying both that the proposition is false and true, that it's wrong to kill sentient beings.
Right. Because
we shouldn't harm We shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily. He's affirming that proposition in its negation.
Yeah, and the reason why is because he's defined kin as those who fall within the circle of altruism. And as soon as they fall within our circle of altruism, they're considered kin, like under this definition. And he's saying that like that wouldn't be the reason why it'd be wrong to harm sentient beings. But the thing is, it's like it has to be because that's the proposition that you affirmed. That's the premise you affirmed. Does that make sense? I know it's a little tricky.
I'm not so sure because he said that the reason that we would make this transition, it wouldn't be because we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily. It'd be because we've expanded our circle of kin or whatever to include animals, and therefore it'd be like that initial premise that makes it wrong, which is the kin one, because we've I think he's putting kin and sentient beings in two different categories and saying like we don't actually care for these animals, or we won't be caring for these animals when the world goes vegan because we think it's wrong to harm sentient beings unnecessarily, but instead because we think it's wrong to harm our kin unnecessarily, and our kin at that point would be put into our circle of care or whatever. I'm not sure if you're following or.
No, I think I see what you're saying.
Are you saying that it's all he's talking about is kind of the attitudes of the people that are
right? Like he's speaking about what it is that will be responsible for people switching or no longer rejecting veganism, and it won't be because it was wrong to harm sentient beings unnecessarily, but it'll be because we had switched what kin means, and protecting our kin is what from unnecessary harm is what drives us. So like that's what I think he's trying to say.
Yeah,
he's making like a descriptive kind of claim about why veganism will win in the end. And it'll be because of this attitude switch with respect to what the definition of kin is, and then it'll be at a point where
it might have just been the way he worded it that confused me, because I took it when he said that it won't be because it's wrong or it won't be because we shouldn't harm. It's true that we shouldn't harm sentient beings. I took that to mean he was saying it's false that we shouldn't harm sentient beings unnecessarily.
Right. I will go back. I will go back a third time just so we can fully confirm. But I think this is why I wasn't really following fully, but. Again, maybe I'm wrong here.
To be honest, the way he's going about this isn't really clear if he's saying that's his position or he's just like speaking.
Yeah, it becomes unclear if he's speaking like descriptively or prescriptively about certain things, and then it causes this kind of confusion. But let's see.
To reiterate my view in relation to the argument, I'm rejecting the first premise altogether. While the proposition that we shouldn't unnecessarily harm sentient beings strikes me as intuitively correct, upon assessment it seems to me that the actual proposition that we accept, that is, the software we're actually running, is we shouldn't unnecessarily harm our kin. As the age of information prospers, living standards increase, and readily available vegan alternatives become the norm, our circle of altruism will eventually expand to encompass all sentient beings, and those who don't share the relevant intuitions will nevertheless live by the vegan ethos, since their well-being is tied to tribe acceptance. So veganism will, at least as far as I'm convinced, eventually win, but it won't be because it's wrong to unnecessarily harm sentient beings. It won't be because the ethical vegan argument is sound. No, it will be because our tentative circle of altruism will, for that time and hopefully forever afterwards, encompass all sentient beings. The real first premise, then, is don't unnecessarily harm our kin.
It's hard to tell because the thing is, it's like, if it's weird because it won't be because it's wrong to harm them. Like, it's just like, I guess like he's trying to make like some descriptive claim as to why.
Right, like it won't be. He's trying to almost say that our moral positions are tied to, with respect to like harming beings and stuff, or not harming beings. They're tied to our definition of kin, and when the definition of kin changes, that is what will cause veganism to quote win. He's making a distinction between like us going vegan because we think it's wrong to unnecessarily harm sentient beings, and instead us going vegan because we think it's wrong to unnecessarily harm our kin.
Okay. I thought
I think it was just the way he worded it threw us off a little bit.
Yeah. And that kind of, I understand the confusion though, because I'm glad we watched it multiple times. But yeah, I'll just keep going here.
Simply isn't entailed by this.
Why no vegan?
So we're at the conclusion now, and I still haven't really, or at least directly answered the question of why I'm not vegan. So let's do it. Well, building upon what we've just covered, I have this following scenario. About 95% of what I consume is vegan, which as said earlier necessitates the death of countless moles, mice and insects. But to be more honest with you than I probably should, when I reflect upon this, I just don't greatly care. But why? Where's the logic? If I won't eat a mole because it effectively decreases my well-being, why don't I lose sleep over killing moles for my crops? And crucially, know that necessity just isn't relevant here. What's relevant is my circle of altruism, my emotional state, and yet it's completely inconsistent, not only in what species are within it, but also what members of each species are within it. Why? And the same is true, though to a far lesser extent, when it comes to the consumption of meat.
My position's inconsistent.
Yeah.
That's just kind of funny. I don't know.
I think he might just be unaware of consistent positions you can take where you're aware that these things are happening. Like we've talked about how we'd accept having to kill off disabled humans that were infringing on crop production.
Yeah.
That's consistent. Mole level intelligent humans that are infringing on crop production.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes to incidental
the journey
deaths
has just begun.
Oh shit. Let me just turn this off 1
What
second.
the hell was that?
I got a new subscriber and it just fucking I'm on Streamlabs, so I didn't turn this shit off.
Oh shit.
That's hilarious.
Like you got a new subscriber like on the YouTube or like
on YouTube, and then you just heard John Venus go, and the journey has just begun, like on my thing. Just funny. Anyway, so what I was saying was that there are consistent positions you can have as a vegan where you acknowledge things like crop deaths. And I just went through the human thing. And then when it comes to the death of moles and all these other things, like I always come back to what we always talk about, which is I don't even know that crop fields are causing a net increase in death in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So like when compared to wildlife that it replaced.
Consumes cows, pigs, chickens, and so on, then they are, over their lifetime, going to commission the exploitation and suffering of a staggering number of sentient beings. And for me, personally, the knowledge of so many animals being harmed simply because I can't stomach the readily available alternatives, which are getting better and better, causes me suffering that far outstrips the pleasure I'd get from eating them. But despite the fact that I'm very selective with where I get my dairy from, if I keep consuming dairy, I'll commission the exploitation and suffering of 3 cows. But similar to the mole situation, I'm not tremendously bothered by this. To be clear, I'm certainly bothered, way more than I am about the moles, but evidently not enough. My circle of altruism is completely inconsistent. But that's the thing, that's what I was expressing in the prior chapter. I don't think that our moral software is consistent. There's a loose, ever-changing circle of altruism, and on a detailed assessment, it doesn't play by the rules of reason. Like aesthetics, it's got objective elements, but it's ultimately subjective. Just as until really recently, our ancestors considered some humans within their tribe, but not others, we only consider some moles in our tribe, but not others.
So this is what I'm hearing, right? Our circle of altruism, inconsistent. Our moral software, inconsistent, right? And if you're trying to explain like there was like the mistaken premise that he actually affirmed, right? Yeah, we shouldn't harm those within our circle of altruism unnecessarily. Right.
The way he worded it was kin, but by kin he meant.
Yeah. And the thing is, if kin or circle of altruism is inconsistent, right, and that proposition would actually just be false. It'd evaluate the false. That's I don't
know what else you can really say here.
Yeah. Because like if you have like, or it's like it's false, or it's not even a proposition, because what the hell is it referring to?
Because if by inconsistent it means like a lot like logically contradictory, then a circle of altruism is just going to be not referencing anything.
Yeah. So like either it's some people take the view that like it's going to evaluate the false, or some people are going to say it's not even a proposition. But at that point, it's still like, what is he saying? Like, if you admitted that this notion's inconsistent, then what the hell are we referring to? So
yeah, and I think he's not aware of a consistent position he can take as a vegan. Like he's observed that he has inconsistent moral attitudes toward the death of moles and the death of cows for steak versus plant production. But if you're watching, Steve, I mean, there are consistent positions you can take, and it seems that Steve's under the conception that crop deaths are even like a bad thing to begin with. I'm not saying they're a good thing, but I'm just not convinced
it's bad.
that they're bad on the net, given what crop fields replace, which is the wild, where there's a host of atrocities occurring. So, and you have the case of like eating animals where there's a clear symmetry breaker. You know, these animals are being bred into existence. They're suffering and they're dying. This is clearly a net increase of this utility, right? That's why we don't consume animal products. So there's also symmetry breakers between crop deaths and deaths derived from animal agriculture, in which animals are bred into existence and all these things. So yeah, I just don't know if he's aware of this stuff. So maybe if he's watching, he can understand this. And if you're watching, Steve, definitely check out my crop deaths video, because I go more into depth into this topic.
Of cows. With all of this said, however, during the month it's taken to produce this video, I further reduced my dairy and egg consumption, and if the world keeps going the way it's going, I'll probably be vegan within the year. But it won't be because I buy the ethical vegan argument. It won't be because our circle of altruism should extend to all sentient beings. No, it will simply be either one, because my circle of altruism will extend to all sentient beings, courtesy of socioeconomic and environmental privileges, or two, because my tribe circle will extend to all sentient beings, and because my well-being is tethered to my tribe. And because my well-being is tethered to my tribe, I'll sing this song. Anyhow, I could go on, and there's a lot.
Just I'm just trying to pick apart what circle of altruism actually means, because it just seems like there's going to be horrible reductios on it. He
had two cases too, where he said, number one, where my circle of altruism changes, or my tribe circle of altruism changes. And just to be clear, guys, before we respond to this, remember, he's talking descriptively about what will make him go vegan. I don't think what will convince him to go. Like he's claimed he doesn't have an argument against it. So he's right now talking about what will make him go vegan, not what arguments make him think that veganism is
he's not
sound.
making any prescriptions.
I get that, but there's even bad reductios against that type of position. Just like, depending on what you mean by circle of altruism, like if your circle of altruism like doesn't extend to certain types of people, depending on what circle of altruism means, then you're just not going to be bothered enough to actually change your behavior towards those groups of people, or not mistreat them in some way. Like even that seems like a reductio against what he's saying.
Yeah. It's weird because I don't know, like making reductios on him describing descriptively what is going to be responsible for his behavior change seems kind of weird to me. I'm not really sure.
I know how you feel, because like he's not like giving like some type of justification,
right?
But he's just giving an explanation as to why like it would change. But the thing is, it's like, now think of it this way: if the state of affairs were tweaked a little bit, and let's say that like instead of animals, it's like black people, right? It's like, listen, like my circle of ultra, like the reason why like I'm gonna be like anti-slavery in the future. It's not because of the arguments or whatever, but it's because it's going to be because of like, one, my circle of altruism will expand to cover them, and two, like my tribe circle of altruism will expand, and my well-being is tethered to my tribe. That sounds a little problematic.
Yeah, and this would be like a scenario where like the premise for that is like, premise one, we shouldn't harm African Americans unnecessarily, and he would say that premise won't be what's responsible for him changing. It'll be the actual correct premise of we shouldn't harm our kin unnecessarily, and our kin have now been redefined in such a way that it now includes African Americans. Like that's kind of like a parallel way of assessing the way in which he views and understands the vegan argument or whatever, which is it's weird. Like I don't know why you wouldn't start from like sentient beings, but I guess he thinks that we're just wired to care about kin like definitions or whatever, or kin, as opposed to like just sentient beings, because he's speaking descriptively about what influences us. So he thinks that the definition of kin and our viewing of our kin circle is what drives our behaviors ethically, not a conception of sentient beings not wanting to be harmed or something.
Right, because even descriptions can have reductios. Like if an argument has a bunch of like descriptive premises, you can still reduce it to like some like unsavory conclusion.
Yeah.
So like even if he's saying that like, hey, like what's responsible for this is that, and I'm like, okay, well, like, I mean, just imagine if like this sort of situation, you're saying that like the reason why you'll stop like treating black people with such disrespect is because for these reasons alone. Like that's kind of be like, I don't know, man. Like I'm not sure if that's the phenomena that's responsible for that. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
We'll see.
And then there's also just the whole empirical claim with this whole kin thing. knowing people's
Yeah.
psychology or underlying psychology for why they hold the specific views they do.
Yeah.
That's something to you have to prove. But I think we're almost done here.
A lot more I'd like to expand upon, but I've got to call this somewhere. If you want to check out some of my other content, please.
Okay, that was the end. Okay, guys. Well, that's pretty much the end of the video. Thank you, Ruxter and Michael, for coming on.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Absolutely.
It was filled with a lot of confusion because there were, even also Rationality rules in his video response to Soy Theist. I believe he acknowledged that he could have been more clear with certain things, or something like that. I'm not really sure. Maybe I'm misremembering that. But yeah, some of these things were very odd, and please let us know below if you have any other objections to what we said, what he said. I'll see you guys in the next video.
Dude,
fuck off. I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who's your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude,